In the midst of wealth and grandeur, there was a mansion untouched by joy, where silence filled every room and love seemed a distant memory. The story of a man who had everything yet lost the one thing that truly mattered, and a woman who walked into his world with nothing but her heart. They say that love can heal the deepest wounds, but can it restore what has been broken for so long? This is a tale of despair, hope, and the powerful change love can bring. But what happens when the heart is too afraid to feel? In the heart of New York, atop a hill, stood a mansion of unmatched grandeur. Its towering glass windows caught the light of the sun, casting a shimmering glow upon the city, making it look like a diamond among a sea of steel and stone. The building's design was modern, sleek, and yet it exuded a sense of classical elegance, as though it had been crafted for someone who had not just wealth, but a legacy to protect. The mansion's stunning exterior, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, seemed almost alive, yet there was a stillness that hung in the air, an unsettling silence that clung to the house as if it were trying to keep its secrets hidden. This mansion was known to its few visitors as the Silent Mansion, not because it was luxurious or grand, but because of the eerie quietness that filled every room, every hallway. There were no voices, no laughter, no music to be heard, just silence. And at the heart of this silence was John Marshall. John Marshall was a man whose name echoed in the corridors of power. He had built a fortune that many could only dream of, a tycoon whose empire stretched across the globe. He owned towering skyscrapers in the city, luxury cars that gleamed under the harsh city lights, and an array of the finest jewels money could buy. He was a man who had everything. Everything except one thing that mattered most: his beloved wife, Elena. Elena was the light of his life, the one person who had truly understood him, loved him unconditionally. She was the heartbeat of their family, the person who made their house feel like a home. She filled the air with her laughter, her warmth, her gentle spirit. She was everything John could ever have asked for, and yet, in a cruel twist of fate, she was taken from him. It was a bitter winter's night, when Elena had gone into labor. The storm outside raged like a wild animal, but inside their home, there was peace. Or so it seemed. They were expecting their first child, a beautiful, healthy baby girl. But as Elena gave birth to their daughter, something went terribly wrong. The doctors rushed in, their faces grim. Elena's heart had failed her. Her body couldn't handle the strain, and within minutes, her life slipped away in the sterile, cold hospital room. John had never felt such a devastating loss. He was holding her hand when she passed, whispering promises of a bright future, of all the things they would still do together. But those promises fell on deaf ears as Elena's final breath left her, taking all of John's joy with it. Her last words, "Please, take care of them," echoed in his mind, a haunting refrain he could never escape. In the wake of her death, John's world shattered. He returned to their mansion, a place that once had been filled with love, with the sound of Elena's voice, but now it was nothing more than an empty shell. He had everything, and yet it all meant nothing without her. The mansion, once filled with warmth and light, grew cold and silent. John withdrew further and further into himself, consumed by grief. He could no longer bear the sight of his daughters, who had been left behind in the wake of their mother's death. The girls, Kaya, Ayana, and Tashina, were so young, so full of life before Elena's passing. But now, they were as broken as John. Kaya, Ayana, and Tashina sat in their cribs, day after day, their eyes vacant and unblinking. They never cried. They never spoke. They never moved. They were like delicate porcelain dolls, lifeless and still. John couldn't bring himself to love them the way they needed. He provided them with everything money could buy: doctors, specialists, therapies, anything they could possibly need. But still, nothing changed. The doctors had no answers. The specialists had no solutions. And so, the silence in the mansion deepened. John found himself retreating further and further into his office. He buried himself in his business, his work, anything to distract him from the crushing emptiness that had taken over his life. He watched his daughters on the monitors installed throughout the house, watched them sit in their cribs, their tiny bodies motionless, their eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. He could see their bodies, but he couldn't see their souls. He couldn't reach them. Why don't they respond? He would ask himself over and over again, It was a question that tormented him, gnawing at his insides like a relentless force. The silence in the mansion was like a weight pressing down on him, suffocating him. It was as though the walls of the house had absorbed his grief, and in doing so, had taken away the very essence of life that once resided there. And so, John became a ghost in his own life, a man trapped in his sorrow, in his failure to protect the family he loved so much. He continued his routine day after day without purpose, without direction. The mansion that was once a symbol of his success had become a prison, a place filled with the ghosts of his past, with memories of a woman who would never come back. Then one day, after months of isolation, a new figure arrived in the mansion, a woman named Emma Collins. Emma was a mature woman in her mid-age, quiet but kind, strong but gentle. She had come from a small neighborhood on Long Island, where she had spent most of her life caring for children. Emma didn't have any prestigious degrees or certificates to boast of, but what she did have was an abundance of heart. She had spent her life raising children, her own siblings, children in her neighborhood, children from broken homes. She understood pain. She understood sorrow. And more importantly, she understood love. Emma had always been drawn to the quiet ones, the children who were often overlooked, the children who were in need of love and care the most. So when she saw the job posting for a nanny in the mansion, she couldn't resist applying. The ad described 3 young girls who had been left behind after the tragic loss of their mother, and Emma's heart ached for them. On the day she arrived at the mansion, she was greeted by a cold silence. The house was immense, too large for one person to truly navigate without feeling lost. But as she walked through its grand halls, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this place than just its opulence. It felt haunted not by ghosts, but by memories. The walls seemed to breathe with the weight of grief, and the emptiness seemed to swallow every step she took. When she was introduced to the girls, she could see at once what had happened. Kaya, Ayana, and Tashina were sitting in their cribs, eyes vacant and still, their bodies unmoving. They were too young to be so detached from the world around them. Emma kneeled down in front of them, trying to make eye contact, trying to connect. "Hello," she said softly. "My name is Emma." Kaya blinked. That was all. But for Emma, it was enough. She had seen it. The tiniest flicker of life, that small movement, that small sign of awareness, gave her hope. She wasn't going to give up on these girls. She wouldn't let them remain lost in their grief. For the first few days, Emma followed the routine as prescribed, feeding the girls, changing them, placing them back in their cribs. But after a while, she realized that this wasn't enough. These girls weren't dolls. They were children. They needed more than just food and schedules. They needed love. They needed someone to see them, really see them, and care for them in a way that went beyond the surface. One afternoon, as the mansion remained still, Emma made a decision. She would sit with the girls at their level and offer them her heart. She opened her arms, speaking softly. "It's okay. I'm right here." She waited, and she waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. Still, the girls didn't move. But then, something miraculous happened. Tashina's hand twitched. Emma's heart leaped. But she stayed still, unwilling to disturb the fragile moment. "You're safe," she whispered. It was small. It was subtle. But it was enough. It was a beginning. As the days passed, Emma continued to care for the girls with patience and tenderness. She spoke to them, sang to them, even when they didn't respond. She knew that love didn't have to be loud or forceful. It could be quiet, gentle, and unwavering. Slowly, ever so slowly, the girls began to change. Kaya, Ayana, and Tashina started to show signs of life. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep Emma going. One morning, Emma took the girls outside into the garden. The sun was warm on their faces, and the grass beneath their feet was cool and soft. She held their hands, guiding them across the lawn, allowing them to feel the earth beneath them for the first time. Kaya frowned. Ayana touched the grass curiously, and Tashina smiled up at the sky, her first smile since Elena's death. "They feel it," Emma whispered to herself. "They just needed time." Time, that was what they needed. Time to heal, time to feel safe, time to reconnect with the world, that had once been so full of life. Emma didn't rush them. She didn't push them to do anything. She simply gave them the time they needed. One evening, as she was changing diapers, Ayanna let out a soft laugh. It was a quiet, delicate sound, but to Emma, it was the sweetest music she had ever heard. She froze for a moment, her heart leaping in her chest. "You laughed," she whispered, tears welling up her eyes. "You laughed." In that moment, something began to shift, not just in the girls, but in John as well. As the weeks passed, the mansion began to change. What was once cold and empty, filled only with echoes of sorrow, slowly started to come to life again. The walls that had once swallowed all sound now seemed to hold the faintest hints of laughter. The once rigid schedule John Marshall had enforced for his daughters began to bend, not through Emma's defiance, but through the quiet insistence of her love. Emma didn't rush. She didn't demand progress. She simply gave the girls something they had been deprived of for so long. Her presence. The girls, once silent and still as statues, had begun to show signs of life. It started with the faintest of movements, a twitch of a hand, a shift in position, a tiny blink of the eye. But for Emma, it was enough to spark hope. John watched, though he tried not to, from the monitors in his office. He frowned at first, frustrated that Emma wasn't adhering to the strict routine he had set. He still couldn't understand how she could make such small changes that appeared to be so insignificant. But as the days passed, a subtle transformation began to take place. Emma had introduced softness back into the mansion. She was patient. She didn't expect the girls to change overnight. And she didn't push them. She simply gave them time. She whispered soothing words, hummed melodies, and let the girls take their time to process everything they had lost and everything they still needed to heal. In the quiet moments, when the girls were all nestled together in their nursery, Emma would sit by their side, not forcing conversation or movement, but simply being present. And it was during one of these quiet sessions, as she sat on the floor with the girls, that something unexpected happened. Tashina, the youngest, let out a sound, a soft, almost imperceptible noise. Emma's heart caught in her throat. It wasn't a cry, not yet. It wasn't even a word. But it was a sound, a real sound, something that had been absent from the house for so long. Emma blinked, her eyes welling up with tears. She couldn't explain why that small noise felt so monumental. It was the first sign that the girls, once trapped in their own grief, were beginning to open up again. Emma smiled softly, watching as the other two girls followed suit, their faces still but relaxed in her presence. Ayanna shifted her weight, and Kaya's small hands reached toward Emma's face. It was an innocent, unspoken connection, one that had been long absent, lost in the depths of the tragedy they had all suffered. Meanwhile, John was struggling with his own emotions. The mansion, once his fortress, had become a place that both suffocated him and drew him in. Emma, though not formally trained, had done something that John couldn't quite grasp. She had broken through the walls of grief that had kept him from his daughters for so long. One evening, as he sat in his office overlooking the city, John gazed out the window. The skyline glittered in the distance, a reflection of his wealth, his success, but it felt distant. He couldn't escape the feeling that something was missing. He had everything he thought would fill the void, but he was still empty. His gaze shifted toward the monitor on his desk, where Emma's soft, gentle movements were captured as she sat beside the girls. Something about her presence calmed him, even though he couldn't quite explain why. John had spent months, no, years, avoiding his daughters, retreating from them in his grief. But as he watched Emma, a flicker of something stirred within him. He wasn't sure what it was, but it felt like warmth, like the first breath of life after a long winter. He got up from his chair and walked to the window, pressing his palm against the cool glass. Outside, the city buzzed with life, but in his own mansion, there was still a deep, painful silence, a silence he had created. And now, as he watched Emma care for the girls, he realized that it didn't have to be this way. The next day, John decided to leave his office and walk to the mansion, something he hadn't done in years. His footsteps echoed through the halls, a stark contrast to the stillness that had permeated the house. He walked slowly, almost hesitantly, as though the mansion might swallow him whole again. When he reached the nursery, He stopped in the doorway, watching from a distance. Emma was sitting on the floor, speaking softly to Kaya, Ayana, and Tashina. She was telling them a story, her voice gentle and calm, and then something unexpected happened. Ayana, the middle child, smiled. It was a shy, small smile, but it was a smile nonetheless. Emma stopped talking for a moment, her eyes widening. It was a breakthrough, a real breakthrough. John felt his chest tighten, and his breath caught in his throat. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. Ayana had smiled. His daughter had smiled. After everything, after years of silence, she had smiled. Tashina reached out toward Emma, her tiny hand curling around the edge of Emma's dress. Kaya leaned in close to Emma's shoulder, and for the first time in a long while, John could see the girls responding, not just Emma, but to the world around them. They were beginning to trust again. It was a quiet moment, but it was a monumental one. In the following weeks, the changes became more apparent. The girls began to speak again, albeit quietly at first. Emma continued to nurture them, never pushing too hard, just letting them move at their own pace. But as they began to blossom, so did John. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, John found himself joining them at the table. It was the first time in a long while that he had sat with his daughters, not as an absent father, but as a presence in their lives. Kaya, still quiet but with a look of contentment in her eyes, reached for her spoon. Ayana giggled, and Tashina smiled brightly at the food before her, eager to dig in. John looked around the table, watching his daughters, their faces soft with the innocent joy of being cared for. He realized in that moment that it wasn't just Emma who had been healing them. It was a love they were all giving one another. Tears welled up in John's eyes, but they were different from the ones he had cried before. They weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of recognition, of understanding. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope. Over time, the mansion began to change in ways that were both subtle and profound. The silence that had once gripped it slowly faded, replaced by laughter, by voices, by the sounds of family coming back together. The cold walls were no longer a prison, but a place of warmth. John began to spend more time with the girls and with Emma, who had quietly transformed not just the lives of the children, but John's as well. The mansion, once a symbol of John's wealth and success, had become a place of healing. The walls that had witnessed so much sorrow now echoed with the sound of life. The mansion was no longer silent. It was filled with the sounds of love and the joy of a family reunited. The next day, John decided to leave his office and walk to the mansion, something he hadn't done in years. His footsteps echoed through the halls, a stark contrast to the stillness that had permeated the house. He walked slowly, almost hesitantly, as though the mansion might swallow him whole again. When he reached the nursery, he stopped in the doorway, watching from a distance. Emma was sitting on the floor, speaking softly to Kaya, Ayana, and Tashina. She was telling them a story, her voice gentle and calm, and then something unexpected happened. Ayana, the middle child, smiled. It was a shy, small smile, but it was a smile nonetheless. Emma stopped talking for a moment, her eyes widening. It was a breakthrough, a real breakthrough. John felt his chest tighten, and his breath caught in his throat. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. Ayana had smiled. His daughter had smiled. After everything, after years of silence, she had smiled. Tashina reached out toward Emma, her tiny hand curling around the edge of Emma's dress. Kaya leaned in close to Emma's shoulder, and for the first time in a long while, John could see the girls responding, not just Emma, but to the world around them. They were beginning to trust again. It was a quiet moment, but it was a monumental one. The next day, John decided to leave his office and walk to the mansion, something he hadn't done in years. His footsteps echoed through the halls, a stark contrast to the stillness that had permeated the house. He walked slowly, almost hesitantly, as though the mansion might swallow him whole again. When he reached the nursery, he stopped in the doorway, watching from a distance. Emma was sitting on the floor, speaking softly to Kaya, Ayana, and Tashina. She was telling them a story, her voice gentle and calm, and then something unexpected happened. Ayana, the middle child, smiled. It was a shy, small smile, but it was a smile nonetheless. Emma stopped talking for a moment, her eyes widening. It was a breakthrough, a real breakthrough. John felt his chest tighten, and his breath caught in his throat. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. Ayanna had smiled. His daughter had smiled. After everything, after years of silence, she had smiled. Tashina reached out toward Emma, her tiny hand curling around the edge of Emma's dress. Kaya leaned in close to Emma's shoulder, and for the first time in a long while, John could see the girls responding, not just Emma, but to the world around them. They were beginning to trust again. It was a quiet moment, but it was a monumental one. The mansion's transformation was complete. No longer was it just a house of wealth and solitude. It had become a home, a sanctuary built on love, patience, and healing. And John knew, deep in his heart, that his greatest wealth wasn't in his empire, but in the family he had rediscovered, and in the woman who had brought them all back to life. The story of the Silent Mansion was no longer a tale of sorrow. It was a story of rebirth, of finding love again in the most unexpected places. And as the sun set over the mansion, casting its golden light across the garden, John Marshall could finally breathe. The silence had faded, replaced by the laughter of his daughters and the love that Emma had brought back into their lives. For the first time in years, John Marshall felt at peace. Moral of the story: even the deepest sorrow could be healed through love, patience, and the courage to open one's heart again. True wealth is not found in material things, but in the relationships we nurture and the connections we make with others. Healing takes time, but with the right support, even the most broken hearts can find their way back to joy.